Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the first book of Kings, that is Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11 of Melachim Aleph. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of the podcast. Thank you for coming back to study with us today. And today we read of the unfortunate decline of King Solomon and the unfortunate end of what was otherwise an incredibly productive and illustrious career as king of United Israel. We pointed out when we studied chapter 10 together how Shlomo had seemed to have achieved, and this was typified and brought out by the encounter between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, that he seemed to have achieved that level at which he could be both wealthy and successful materially in this world on the one hand, and on the other hand, remain faithful to God, remain wise, remain just, remain righteous, remain a appropriate ruler for the people of Israel, spreading that message of God to others around the world, as, for example, Queen of Sheba herself learned that lesson from him when he came. However, we then continued to read how Shlomo made the three mistakes which are delineated in the clear instructions be given to the kings of Israel, the future kings of Israel, in the book of Deuteronomy, which were not to accumulate too much wealth and not to build up their military with horses too much, because of the inherent dangers that lie in those issues. The third thing that future kings are warned against is having too many wives, for that will potentially draw his heart away from God and to indulging into other things which would take him away from the mission that he should have as a true king. And that is what we're about to read in this chapter, how Shlomo made this mistake as well, having thus made all three mistakes that the kings were warned against. And despite, for a time, seeming like he would get away with it and remain steady and remain faithful to God, and nonetheless he fell to these temptations and turned away from God near the end of his life in a very unfortunate way. So let's see, this is chapter 11. We're going to read about this right now. V'yamelech Shlomo, and the King Solomon, Ohav nashim nachriot rabot. He loved many foreign women. Viet bat Paro, and the daughter of Paro. So the daughter of Paro, the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, seems to have been his primary wife the entire time. She's always mentioned alone. The others are mentioned as part of a group. Moaviot, of the many women that he loved, many of them were Moabites, Ammoniot, Ammonite women, Adomiot, Edomite women, Sidoniot, from Sidon, from Tyre, Chitiot, or Hittites. The Tyrian women were also what we would now know today as Phoenician descent from that ethnicity. Min hagoyim asher amar Adonai b'nei Yisrael, specifically from those nations which God had instructed the people of Israel. Lo sava'u b'hem, do not intermarry with them. V'hem lo yava'u b'chem, do not let them join you. Because God knew that their particular brands of worship, their style, their lifestyle, their opinions, their philosophies were contrary and opposite to what God was trying to teach the people of Israel, to teach the world. Their polytheistic, paganistic, and corrupt practices were exactly what God did not want the people of Israel to know from, and God knew that should they intermarry, this would be a way to bring those corrupt influences into the people of Israel and take them away from their mission which is to bring ethical monotheism to the world. God instructed them not to, because if they do, they will turn your hearts acharei Elohim, away from God and towards their gods. Bohem dovak Shlomo li'avon. Nonetheless, Shlomo, in his love for these women, he attached himself to these women. Vayhi lo nashim soros shiva me'os. He had 700 wives, ufilakshim, and an additional concubines, shlosh me'os, 300. Vayatu nashav et libo, and sure enough, these women turned his heart away from God. Vayihil eit ziknat Shlomo, and it was as Shlomo became older, nashav hitu et levavo, his wives did turn his heart away, acharei elohim achirim, away from God and towards these other gods. V'lo hayal levavo shalem im Adonai Elohav, and his heart was no longer complete, was no longer devoted to God, the Lord his God, kilevav David aviv, as King David's heart was always devoted towards God. And to the extent of which Vayelach Shlomo acharei Ashtoret, Shlomo went and worshipped the god of Ashtoret, Sidonim, who was the god of the Tyrian women, the women from Sidon, from Sidon, the Acharim Milkom, and his heart was turned after Milkom, who was Shikutz Ammonim, the abomination of the people of Ammon. Vayat Shlomo hara be'enei Adonai, and Shlomo did evil and bad in the eyes of God. V'lo milei acharei Adonai ki David aviv, and he was not complete and whole following God as David his father was. So, and this occurred near the end of Shlomo's life, and it gets worse. As Yivne Shlomo bama l'chmosh shikutz Moav, and Shlomo built an altar to Chemosh, who was the abomination of the Moabites. This was the third god. So Shlomo was running after several of these gods. Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, Bahar, on the mountain Asher al Pnei Yerushalayim, opposite Jerusalem, Ulamolech, and to Molech, who was the Shikutz B'nei Ammon, who was the abomination of the people of Ammon. So and Molech, we know, was worshipped through child sacrifice. Just these awful practices and abominations that involved corruption and terrible sacrificial practices, human sacrifice, and just bad stuff Shlomo got involved in, building these bamot, these houses of worship, just opposite the temple of God in Jerusalem. And not only that, this is what he did for all of the foreign wives, each one coming from different places with different practices and different gods. He supported all of them in their worship of bringing incense and sacrifices to their gods. And God became very angry with Solomon, with Shlomo, because his heart had turned away from God, the Lord of Israel, who had shown himself twice, who had spoken with Shlomo twice. And he had already commanded him very carefully, very clearly. He had commanded him regarding this issue, Levilti Leches, not to turn acharei Elohim achirim towards other gods. V'lo shamar eit asher tzivah Adonai, and he did not keep that which God had commanded him. It's just interesting here because one interesting fact about Shlomo is we do see that God spoke to him twice. The first time when when God asked Shlomo what he wanted, and Shlomo asked for wisdom, and that was early on in his career. And then later, after Shlomo said his prayer at the dedication of the temple, God accepted Shlomo's prayer. Both times, of course, God warned him to be faithful to God's commandments. Now, what we don't find with Shlomo, which makes him different from all the other kings, both the Israelite and the Judahite kings that are to follow throughout this book, and King Saul and King David that preceded him, they all had prophets. They all had someone else who was the one who conveyed God's words and commandments to them. Shlomo did not. Now, this is just something to think about. Shlomo, God spoke to him twice, and we'll see soon a third time. But there was no prophet in Shlomo's government, or at least none that we find mentioned throughout his life and career. One wonders if this was, one gets the feeling that this was a sort of an arrogance on the part of Shlomo. Shlomo arrogantly chose to violate the 3 rules given to the kings of Israel, the rules about too much wealth, too many horses, too many wives, because he thought that he himself was above the temptations that everyone else will fall to those temptations, but not me. And he was so confident in his own relationship with God that he didn't seek the objectivity that another person would bring to the table, another person who's a representative of God. And sometimes if someone else is your teacher, he can show you things that you yourself don't notice, because in your own arrogance, in your own selfishness, you don't see your own flaws. And a prophet, a teacher, someone else who has a relationship with God would have been so important. But over here, it specifically mentions here, by Shlomo's mistake, it mentions that God himself had appeared to him twice, in his entire career twice. But had he had a prophet, he would have been hearing and listening to the lessons of God the entire time. It's almost as if he chose this, although you don't see it anywhere in the text. It's just a sense and a feeling that one gets. Now, if we continue in chapter 11, Vayomer Adonai l'Shlomo, now God for a third time says to Shlomo Solomon, he speaks with him and says as follows, Ya'an asher hoisa zos imach, because this, in other words, this behavior that we just listed is with you, v'lo shamarta brisi v'chukosai, and you have not kept my covenant, you have not kept my agreements, you have not kept my laws, asher tzivitzi alecha, that I did command you, koroa ekra et hamamlacha mi'alecha, I am going to tear the kingdom away from you, unasati alavdecha, and I'm going to give it to one of your servants. Ach bi'amechalo esena, but I'm not going to do it while you're alive, leman David avicha, because of the promise I made to David. I told him that his son would be a king over the entire Israel, so I'm going to keep that promise. So during your lifetime, you will remain a king over united Israel. Miad bincha ekra'ena, but from your son, I am going to tear it away. God had said this in his warnings many times. If you keep the rules, then you maintain the kingdom. If you don't, then you don't. However, Raket kol hamamlacha lo ekra, I will not take away the entire kingdom. I will shevet echad etein livnecha, but one tribe I will give your children. So your descendants will remain kings over one of the tribes. Leman David avdi, in order to keep the promise I made with David my servant. Leman Yerushalayim asher bacharti, and because of Jerusalem that I have chosen, I am not going to take that entire thing away. There will be one of the tribes will remain, and your descendants will remain king over that one tribe, which we, of course, will find out is the tribe of Judah, the tribe from which Shlomo Solomon comes, his own native tribe, the one that will remain, but the rest will be taken away from you, and because of your behavior. Vayakam Adonai Satan l'Shlomo, and at this point, everything starts to unravel. Shlomo, who had been a king with peace and all of his borders, that peace only lasted so long, and the peace began to unravel, and enemies started to pop up. So God made a Satan, an adversary to Shlomo, to Solomon, and who was that? Et Hadad ha'adomi, Hadad the Edomite, Mizera hamelach hu be'edom. He was, among the Edomites, he was one of the royal family. Now the verses go and give us a little bit of history. And it was when David was in Edom. Remember, David waged war against the Edomites. Ba'alot Yoav Sar Hatzava, when Yoav, who was David's general, went to Edom, l'kaber et hachalalim, in order to bury those that had died in battle against Edom. Vayach kol zachar be'Edom, and at that time he struck down and killed all of the males, all of the men of Edom. Kisheshet chadashim yoshav sham Yoav v'chol Yisrael. For 6 months, Yoav waged war and against the Edomites, ad hichris kol zachar be'Edom, until all of the males in Edom had been killed. This was the battle which was ongoing when David sent Uriah to his death in order to marry Bathsheba, who was Shlomo's father. So this battle was a place where the sins of Shlomo's family were evident, where those sins were reminded, people were reminded of those origins, that sin that could have been and was erased to some degree, at least with the genuine and true repentance that David had done, but the reminders of it are still lingering. And now the enemy is, of course, going to come from the remnants of that battle. Vayivrach Hadad, because what happened then? Hadad, who and his men, Vanashim Adomim, and other Edomite men, they were able to escape Me'avdei Aviv, right? The other men from the servants of Hadad, of Hadad's father, who was the king of Edom. Ito lovo Mitzrayim. They escaped to Egypt. V'Hadad nar katan. At the time, Hadad was a young boy. Vayakumu mi Midyan vayavo Paran. They left Midian, and they came eventually to Paran. Vayikhu anashim imam mi Paran, and some men from Paran joined them. So there was a group of men, or a group of people. Vayavo Mitzrayim. Eventually they came to Egypt. El Paro melech Mitzrayim, to Paro, the king of Egypt. Vayitin lo bayit v'lechem, and he gave him food. He gave him a place to live. Amar lo, that he assigned. In other words, food that he set aside and told his people to supply them with food. Ve'eretz nasan lo, and he gave him land so that he can live and make a living under the auspices of the Egyptians. Interestingly, Vayimtso Hadad chen be'enei Paro ma'od, and Paro liked Hadad. He liked him very much. Vayitin lo isha et achos ishto, and he had him marry into the royal family by giving his wife's sister, his sister-in-law, who was Achot Tachpenes Hagvira. The queen Tachpenes, who was Paro's wife, had a sister who was given to Hadad as a wife. So Hadad was now a member of or married into the royal family, which means that Hadad's wife was also the aunt of Shlomo's wife. So Paro was connected through marriage both with Hadad, who is about to become, in a minute we'll see, Shlomo's chief enemy, and also Paro was allied both with Shlomo and Hadad, with both sides. Vateled lo achos Tachpenes, that's Genuvat beno, the sister of Tachpenes, right, gave birth to Genuvat, who became Hadad's son. Vatigmeleu Tachpenes b'toch beis Paro, and this Tachpenes was raised and born in the house of Paro. Vayi Genuvat beit Paro b'toch bnei Paro, and Genuvat became, and it remained in and was raised in Pharaoh's house among the children of Pharaoh himself. V'Hadad shoma, and then Hadad heard b'Mitzrayim, in Egypt, ki shachav David im avotav, that David died and passed away. V'chimet Yoav sar tzava, and his enemy Yoav had died, the king, the general. Vayomer Hadad al Paro shalcheni v'elech artzi, send me, I want to go back home to Edom, to my homeland. Vayomer lo Paro, and Paro said, Ki ma ato chaser imi, what are you missing here with me? You have a great life here, you have everything you need. V'incha mevakesh lelachet el artzecha, and you want to go back to your land. Vayomer, and he said, Lo ki shaleach teshalcheni. He says, no, I don't want to stay here. I understand, I appreciate everything, but please send me home. I want to go home. Vayokam Elohim lo so Hadad is now an enemy of Shlomo, because of course what Shlomo's family had done to Hadad's entire country, devastated their country, and Hadad set himself up back in Edom, because now we see Shlomo's kingdom starting to fall apart because of the deeds, because Shlomo is not paying attention to his true mission, and is going off following other gods. Vayokem Elohim lo Satan es Rezon ben El Yedah, and then another enemy that God set up for Shlomo. So not just on the south, the Edomites, which would have been the southeastern flank, but this is going up towards the northeastern flank, which would be in the area of more or less where modern Syria is today, at Rezon ben El Yedah. Another enemy named Rezon, the son of El Yedah, Asher barach me'et Hadad Ezer melech Tzova Adonav. He had run from Hadad Ezer, who was the king of Tzova, that was originally his master. Vayikbotz lavan Hashim, and he gathered men around him. Vahisar Gedud, and he became a chief in charge of a group of soldiers. Baharog David Osam. And he was there when David had killed them, David had waged war against them. So he also had reason to be an enemy of Shlomo because of revenge against his father David. Vayelchu damesek vayishu ba, and they went after that defeat at the hands of David. They went to Damascus and they settled there. Vayimlechu b'Damasek, and they became established a kingdom in Damascus. And this man, Vayhi Satan li Yisrael, he became an enemy to Israel, Kol Yemei Shlomo, all the days of Shlomo, V'yatara Asher Hadad, and this was in addition to the trouble that Hadad, which was from Edom, was causing. Vayakatz Israel, and they hated Israel. They caused problems for Israel. Vayimloch al Aram, and he became king over Aram, Aram, which comprises the area where Damascus was. So here we have Shlomo's kingdom starting to fall apart. Here we have the people from two places causing enemies, becoming enemies to Shlomo as a result of his neglecting his mission to live the life that God had commanded him to do. We will continue our study in the next podcast of the rest of this chapter 11 of the end of Shlomo's kingdom and the death of Shlomo, which we will read about in the next podcast together. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to finishing this chapter and the entire book of Kings together. Have a wonderful day.